Okay, so hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Full Global. This is where we connect with global first entrepreneurs and remote work experts from all around the world. Our guest today is Kaleem Clarkson, a remote work expert and CEO at BlendMe. Kaleem, thanks for joining us today.
Oh man, thanks for having me. I love your name too. It's Vit, right?
Yeah,
VIT is just strong. It's just strong. I love it.
yeah,
Three
thank you,
letters.
thank you. And basically, to kick things off, I'd like to
Mhm.
talk more about your career journey, right? So you have a pretty interesting background, including being named as one of the top 15 remote work advocates and leaders. So, can you share some insights from your experience that have shaped your passion for remote work and this global workforce?
Yeah, I mean, I think really where it all kind of stemmed from. My partner and I are originally from the Maine in the United States, which is like the really it's probably the most northeastern state in the country, closer to Canada, and we ended up moving to Atlanta, Georgia, which is like next to Florida on the southeast of the United States, and it's a lot more warm. Let's put it that way. There's a ton of snow in Maine, right. But our families are still there, so every summer we try to go back home to visit our family. And I think the first time we did this, and we're talking about 2000, 7 or 8. I just remember having this feeling of, wow, wouldn't it be great to, come home every summer and stay with the families for the whole summer? And then following that, I ended up attending this in 2012. I ended up attending this conference in a web developer conference. I'm a former front end engineer, and it was DrupalCon Denver. Drupal's open source software. Shout out to Drupal. So I went to this event in DrupalCon Denver, and the CEO from a company called Lullabot was giving a talk on how they built a culture in a virtual first company. They got rid of their office, and their clients were like the Grammys, which is really big, MarthaStewart.com, like huge brands in the US. And I just found that talk fascinating. He was showing pictures of their retreat. And at the time, again, this is 2012. At that time, you didn't see pictures of companies going on retreats. It just didn't happen. So when I really just heard him talk about like how, I think he said something along the lines of, I feel closer to my team than I ever have. Those were just really eye-opening comments. And on the flight home, I just started thinking, this would be really great if we could work all summer from our home state, and be with our family. So my partner, she ended up getting her master's degree from the University of Connecticut in organizational development and human resources. She was pretty frustrated with the job market at the time. People operations wasn't even a term or a phrase, and her thesis was on employee engagement, and those jobs just weren't open. So 2013, I just after that conference, I came back and I said, why don't we just start our own HR consultancy, but only for remote companies? And yeah, so we incorporated in 2013 as a side hustle, and the rest is history, man.
And speaking about Blend Me, right? Blend Me is
Yeah.
currently focused on various aspects of this remote employee experience, right? And
Yes.
one
Yeah.
of the key aspects is, from what I understood, is defining the
Mhm.
difference between different types of remote work, right? Different
Yeah.
models such as fully
Yeah.
distributed, hybrid remote, and
Mhm.
telecommute, right? So how how have these models evolved, right, since you
Yeah.
started the company, and this changing expectations of employees and employers? I would like to talk more about that.
Yeah, so when we started in 2013, we have a higher education background. Both of us spent over 10 years in higher education. So I'm very passionate about research and paying homage to like people who've done things before us. And when we first started researching, Jack Nillis is kind of like the godfather of telework. He's like the one who coined the term telework. So when we started researching that, and I think they started doing that in about 1960 something, former NASA person. Um, we just really kind of looked at like, wow, there are different versions of telework, and you're starting to see that word kind of phase out from popularity. But um, what we ended up doing was looking at, well, what are the different types of remote work? And prior to the pandemic, there was really only two types, really, right? You had companies that were fully remote, and then you had organizations that allowed their employees to telecommute a couple days a week. So hybrid really wasn't a model as much. So then, leading up to the pandemic, we started hearing a little bit more about hybrid. I believe Dropbox was one of the first companies to kind of really talk about it before the pandemic. So we have defined the three different remote work models, and the reason why is because when we're speaking with clients, we have to be on the same page, and that's where I think today, and the challenge with today is that hybrid has such a huge range, and I feel like leadership, like prior to the pandemic, hybrid, when you talk to a few people about hybrid, it would be half of the workforce would commute to the office, or every single day, and then another portion would be fully remote, and that was the extent of hybrid. There wasn't much more than that. Now with the pandemic, and executives, and people trying to say how many times per week, it's become a little bit more complicated. So these are the way that when we talk with clients, these are the definitions that we provide. So one of the things that we two of the things that we thought about when coming up with our definitions were, um, is there a centralized what is the centralized workplace or a centralized office? And then, how many times per week would it be hybrid? Because in our opinion, 4 days in office and 1 day working remotely is not hybrid. That is not a hybrid model, but some people would try to explain it that way. So here are our three definitions. So an all remote company or fully distributed company, they have no centralized workplace, and employees work from wherever they're the most comfortable and the most productive. So I think that's pretty easy to kind of understand. Fully remote, fully distributed, boom, it's over there. Um, Hybrid remote. Now, this is where we use hybrid remote for a reason, not just hybrid, because we believe that if you are going to do hybrid correct, then you need to really emphasize a remote first operational model. So we actually call it hybrid remote as for hybrid. So in this situation, a company has a centralized workplace where some employees work and commute to, while others work remotely. So there's really no kind of like um, quantifying the numbers there, because like it's such a wide range. But what we ended up doing here is, like, when we thought about telecommute, and the third option is telecommute. Um, Telecommute is where your employees are required to commute to your workplace for a majority of the work week. So, in our opinion, if you are required to work in office 3 days a week, we consider that telecommute, because your model has a majority of the work week is in office, and really your employers, they're not changing the way you really operate by a ton. A lot of decisions are still made in the office. Like, a lot of things are still an office first or an on-site first mentality, so we just call it telecommute. So if you're required to go into your office to commute to your workplace for a majority of the work week, then we consider that telecommuting. So that's how we define the three different models of remote work.
Gotcha. And you know, on my podcast, I usually talk to global first entrepreneurs who have ready, build this remote teams, global teams.
Hmm.
And there's an opinion that remote work works,
Hmm.
on-site work works, but hybrid doesn't work. I mean,
Mm,
I
mm.
heard this opinion from like a number of global first entrepreneurs and remote work entrepreneurs, and the
Yeah,
reason why
yeah.
they're saying that is that just when you have some people on site and some people who are just work from home, you
Hmm.
cannot like your I don't know, like it's pretty much damaging for your team culture, for your company culture.
Right,
What can you
right.
say about that?
Um, I don't know. I think it's pretty difficult to say whether it works or not yet. Like we're still, again, in my opinion, I feel like the hybrid today is very new. So we're probably 2 years, well, I guess 3 years now. Wow, time is flying. So I would agree from a standpoint of when this hybrid, there's an A team and there's a B team. And, in sports in the United States, I don't know if they do this in Europe and stuff like that, but like you could make the varsity team, like in middle school, you could make the A team, which is the varsity team, the best team. Or if you're not so great, you can make the junior varsity team or what they call the B team. You're still playing, but you're not on the team that's like the best team. I kind of articulate that when if you're doing a hybrid model, most organizations aren't putting in the work that you need to put in to make hybrid like be really, really work very well. So I would agree and say that whenever especially when you have meetings, like the people on site in the conference room on a camera and then the people on Zoom, there's always an A team and there's always a B team. And no matter what, you actually can't make those experiences the same. Like, I feel like that's the big challenge right now. Everyone's like, "Oh, well, how do we make it, how do we make the remote employees feel as engaged and, how can we make these two different models as close as possible?" Well, you can't. You can't emulate being in person. Like, there's an energy. If I was sitting in that room with that dope ass default global sign next to you, like there'd be light shining off my face. We'd be cracking jokes. There would be an energy in there, man, that you can't replicate. So I would agree with most of your guests, but the one thing I would say is that it can be done. The question is what how far is the organization willing to go to make it work, right?
Hmm.
So right now I'm the fractional chief people officer for a sock manufacturer.
Mm,
They
interesting.
decided to go hybrid.
Hmm.
They're based out of Manhattan. So they were really in the thick of COVID in the US, like the epicenter, really. So they were forced. They didn't have a choice. Like their
Hmm.
landlord, their building forced them to go home. And they even had a policy in their handbook that said no remote working is allowed, no working from home is allowed.
Hmm.
So they reached out to me and said, "Hey, our employees are much happier. They're not having to deal with a 2 hour commute." Because when you live in New York City, you got to take the train everywhere. And those commutes can be an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. The average commute, I think, was an hour and 40 minutes or something like that.
Hmm.
And they said, we want to give this flexibility. Now, their hybrid, you know, they had already thought about the number of times, but after we did the research and the analysis of what the employees want, they only require people to go into the office once a week.
Right.
So to me, right, that requirement to go in once a week, and then of course they have as necessary because they deal with product. So if like a piece of product comes in, if a sock comes in and someone needs the salesperson needs to touch it and feel it to make sure it's right, they have to go in. So a lot of
Hmm.
times it's like 2 times per week, but a lot of times it's not. So the reason why hybrid is working, so hybrid for GMI, the sock manufacturer, the reason why we feel like it's working so far is number one, they're only required to go into the office once per week or as needed. So there's a lot of flexibility in that, right? They get to choose what day. They don't have to go in on the same day. So there's choice. The reason why it's working is because they reached out to a remote work expert to say, hey, we want to be a hybrid company, but we understand we need to be kind of remote first in how we operate. Like, so we moved all of their policies onto Notion. We built an intranet. We are updating all of their internal communications on how they communicate. Everything that you would do in these global companies that you were talking about that are successful in remote work, annual retreats, everything that you would see in a remote company, they're doing as a hybrid company. because you never know where someone is in a hybrid company. They're location independent. So really, in order for a hybrid to work, you have to be remote first.
Got it. And let's talk a bit about trust, right?
Yes.
Trust
Yeah.
in remote work. Can you delve deeper into this concept and explain how trust in remote work differs from the traditional office-based trust? Let's call it like that.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I mean, trust is important for on-site and remote, right? Like, so what we looked at is we looked at the employee experience. And Gallup does a great job on defining what the employee experience is. We love their definition. But when we were thinking about it, we were like, well, what's different about the remote employee experience? Is there a difference? And we can argue that there really isn't a difference. If you were to go in there and do everything correctly, um, attracting the right talent, hiring the right talent, onboarding, engaging them, developing them, measuring their performance, and then offboarding. Like that's the employee life cycle. That's the employee experience. But one thing that we kind of really thought about every time we kept looking and researching, we were like, geez, trust is really important. Like trust is critical. And remote work, the remote employee experience has to be rooted in trust. The on-site experience, it doesn't I mean, in a perfect world, you would want it to be trust, but you don't need it. You don't need it to work because like that's why the office was originally created was to watch over people. Being in the factories next to each other lined up and then move into the cubicles and then all of that was about ensuring people were getting the job done. In a remote work setting, you have to trust that your employees are going to get the work done. You have to trust that your process, your interview process, how you evaluate your candidates, you have to trust that that's going to work. But then these things are a two-way street. So the employer has to trust the employee that they're going to get the job done, but the employee has to trust the employer that they're going to follow through on the things that they said that they were going to do when they interviewed. Like, oh yeah, we're not doing raises based on FaceTime. It's structured, right? Like we're going to do results based promotions. Like, okay, great. I have to trust that the company is going to follow through on that. So then there's trust. Then there's our responsibility. Um, and again, responsibility, it's a two-way street. The employer has to be responsible for ensuring that the employee has all the resources they need, the equipment, the setup, how we're doing things, right? Everything that you need to get the job done. But then the employee has to take on the responsibility to ask questions when they don't know how to do something, to get the job done, right? Like you have to take on the responsibility. So that's how we came up with what we call TREE. That's our acronym TREE, the remote employee experience. And T stands for trust, R stands for responsibility, and the EE is employee experience.
Got it. And at this point, we see that some big names from the technology, from the financial world, right? They have started calling employees back to the office at least
Mm,
a few days a week, but that's just the start, right? So,
yeah,
do you
yeah.
think that is just a phase, or are we going back to the old office routine?
You know, that's um, that's a great question, and I think it's kind of twofold. Personally, I feel like a lot of leadership right now are not being honest with their intentions of hybrid. Let's put it that way. I believe hybrid is a bridge to some leaders trying to say, okay, we've tried this hybrid situation. It didn't work. We're going to go all out. Everyone's going to have to return to the office full time. Again, because we talked about this earlier, hybrid is really hard. It is the hardest model by a long shot. So, in order for you to do that correctly, a lot of people have to change the way they've thought over the years, how they've gotten how they've been promoted. They have to change their way of thinking, right? Like we just talked about trust. Like if you're not a non-truster, how do you convert a non-truster type person into a truster, right? So I do feel that a lot of organizations are going into this hybrid work arrangement with not the best intentions. Because to do it correctly, you wouldn't just be forcing everybody back to the office to begin with, right? You would collect data, you would listen to your employees, you'd have these open forums, you would let employees be a part of the conversation. You would then design different operational, 'cause then you would have a committee that looks at all your operational processes, how you get people promoted, how do you, like the employee experience, how do you hire, how do you remote? You would have a committee working on all of those things to make hybrid work. So to me, if a company is like, yeah, you just have to come back into the office 2 days a week, that's it, or whatever, and they're not providing, you're not seeing a change in how you meet and how you do things. I do believe that some people will use this hybrid thing as a way to say, okay, we tried it, it didn't work, so now we're going to go back to the way things used to be. On the flip side, I do believe that there are some organizations that are leaning into this and really giving it a try. And there will be some that decide, you know what? Why are we bringing these people into the office to do Zoom meetings?
Mhm.
So let's just go fully remote. So
Mhm.
I do think that there will be some organizations because the one thing that I think a lot of people aren't talking about when we're looking at these forced return to office. I mean, a lot of people are talking about this.
Yeah.
Is the commercial real estate, is the relationship. Um, that's an investment. There's value to that investment. Companies invest in buildings. Some of them purchase. If
Mhm.
they don't purchase, they lease, right? A lot of companies have signed 8, 10 year leases. So it will be interesting to see when some of those leases run out.
Mhm.
What's going to happen? Are some of those companies who've been trying hybrid and it hasn't been working great, are they going to say, oh, let's sign another lease, right? Or are they going to say, geez, it hasn't been working great. People aren't listening to the rules anyway. That's another statistic that's out there. All these companies that you mentioned that are forcing return to the office, they're not even working because people aren't even listening.
Yeah.
Like they're not reporting on the actual numbers of the increase. I think Amazon said it's going to take 3 years before like the return is in full effect. So yeah, that's I think it's going to be um more people going back to the way it was before the pandemic
Mhm.
than people going fully remote. But I do believe we're going to come out of this obviously with more people working fully remote than before the pandemic. So you got to kind of take it with a grain of salt. We're not going to be at that 60% that we were working remotely at the peak of the pandemic. We're right around, I want to say it's about like 26% right now. They project it's going to probably drop down to even like 15%. But before the pandemic, it was only like 4%.
Mhm.
So we do have to kind of take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and but in fact, there are not only like executives and managers who are kind of against this remote work. There are also just people. I mean, uh, recently I noticed I found this research, and it was said that like around 21% of people said that their biggest struggle with remote work is ending up staying at home like too much, right?
Yeah.
Also, for some
Yeah.
people, remote work seems to be causing this they feel like isolated, right?
Mm.
It's something that can impact their mental health and productivity. So
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
can we tackle this issue and keep the team spirit alive even when we're like a miles apart, and keeping our health and just mental health issue on the right level, I would say.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say that yeah, everyone doesn't prefer remote work. I mean, that's absolutely the case. The one thing that I would have to say, and now that we're further away from the pandemic, it's not as relevant. But earlier, like pandemic remote work was not the normal ways of remote work. Now that learning how to live with COVID and those challenges and how to navigate those things, people are a lot more comfortable coming together again. So what I would say is, prior to the pandemic, working remotely was not necessarily really isolating. I mean, let me rephrase. Yes, you're not going into an office and connecting with people, but you had opportunities to build on those connections. You go to meetups, you can work at a co-working spot, you can do all of these different things. So one of the things that we talk with leaders about is that, yeah, and I think even in Buffer state of remote work, one of the when you add up all of their different challenges, I think like 58% of the challenges or the struggles have to deal with some level of connection, right? So, what we've kind of been advising organizations is look, if we know that the biggest downfall to remote work or the biggest downfalls to remote work have to deal with connection, loneliness, um, working too much, or not leaving your home. Sorry, excuse me, not leaving your home, working too long, difficulty collaborating with others, difficulty working across time zones. If you know those are the biggest challenges, then we feel like that the most important thing for you to do is to address those challenges. And we think to address those challenges, we address them with um, what we call social connection strategy. Okay, so we group connections into three different types: professional connections, mentors, your associations, people that you kind of you work with, right? Mastermind groups. Those are your professional connections. Then we have lifestyle connections. So things you like to do, hobbies, running, jogging. I like to mountain bike, right? Those are your friends, like your close friends, hanging out, going out to the bars or whatever, the pubs, whatever. Like those are your lifestyle connections, right? But then there's intimate. And intimate connections are people get really cringy when we talk about the employer and intimate connections. So, yes, romantic relationships with partners, that's part of it. But then you also have religion. It's really a deeper, intimate connection for somebody, right? Like you're not necessarily always bringing that to the to workspace. And then you also have politics. I mean, those things are very intimate. Those are intimate relationships, and you want to ensure that your employees have access to make all of those connections, right? So we tell people build a social connection strategy that addresses all those different connections. So you're going to have a retreat. Make sure that there's opportunities for people to cross department connect with professionals, and maybe you have some speakers come in, and maybe you're doing a meetup. Then you have lifestyle. Make sure you add some kayaking or something fun in there. And then intimate connections allow people to at least connect on that deep level. And I'm not saying like companies should create a dating website or anything like that. But no, when you ask people, I always do this in presentations. I ask, how many people in the room know someone else who met their significant other at work? And it's a lot. Everybody knows someone. So just knowing that connections are the biggest challenge for remote work, that's what we suggest. We suggest employers develop this social connection strategy based on data, and they
Hmm.
create these opportunities. If they don't create the opportunity themselves, they at least provide resources where people can go outside and make those connections.
Got it. Kaleem, and probably my last question. What
Yeah.
other three key pieces of advice would you give to entrepreneurs and executives who are new to remote work and global hiring?
Okay. So are you talking about someone who's starting from
Yeah,
day
who have
one?
never
They
done
just
this
started the
before. Hmm.
Okay. What about has the company already existed? I think that this is an important distinction. So, am I creating the company from scratch, or has the company already existed and I want to
Well,
transition?
considering my audience, I guess we're talking about startups who are just
Okay.
launching, right?
Just
So,
launching. I think that's great. So, preferably, That's where you want to start. It's much easier to start fresh versus changing something that you've been doing for a long time. So, the first thing that I would suggest for a startup is to decide what is really important to you as the founder. And what I mean is the um, location critical for your business function, or is is your business function location independent, meaning that we can do our business anywhere in the world, right? So if you are a shopping market, you're creating a shopping market startup. I mean, I know startups are generally in tech, but I'm just using this for an example. If you're a trucking startup and you're building stuff for trucks, like you probably that's a kind of a location based business, right? Like or a supermarket or a restaurant. That's a location based business. If you're doing a technology that's only for Europeans or only for people in the US, well, that is location dependent. Like you can be flexible in those areas, but you can't be flexible globally. Once you make that decision, now that you know based on your location, now you have to kind of decide where am I going to spend my money as soon as we get some funding, right? You get just for simple mathematics, you get $100,000. Are you going to spend, you know, 20,000 of that dollars on office space? Or are you going to use that, or do you need to use that 20,000 on marketing or other things? So, number two is deciding what your finances, what are you going to do with money and where do you need to spend it? Because now you know that you started number one, where based on your location. So now you know whether you can be fully remote, right? Or location based. Now you know, okay, if I get X amount of dollars, I have to spend it this way. Or yeah, I actually feel like we can spend it on office. Now you're making that decision. Like, yes, we're gonna have an office. Maybe I only want to spend 10,000. So we do co-working. We give out co-working space vouchers. Um, and then I do think I'm not really going in the perfect order, but I do think like how do you want to be known as an organization? Like, what is your employee value proposition going to be to employees? Like, how are you going to attract? Like, how do you want default global to be known? Right? Like, how do you want the company to? How do you want Go Globy to be known? Do you want to be a family based kind of culture where flexibility is key, people first are key, right? Or do you want to be like Netflix, work 90 hours or X or Twitter, whatever they call Twitter now, X? Or do you want people to work 70 hours, 80 hours a week? By the way, there's nothing wrong with being Netflix or X and, you know, working 80 hours a week. There's nothing like people can do what they want to do. But once I think you know those four things, I think then you can start planning your remote work model because those four things will help you kind of guide how you're going to do anything. If you're a people first company, like that's your culture. Yes, I want this to be, if I can make $100, I'd rather make $90 and have people happy. If that's kind of like your attitude and your mentality, then you're going to go with maximum flexibility. You're going to be like, okay, we're a remote first company. You can work from anywhere. You can do whatever you want, as long as you get your job done, that might be that. But let's just say, like, no, man, we're building this really hard product. It's really complicated. Like, I need to be in a room I need to be in a room at least a few times a week with developers, design thinkers, all these people. All right. Well, we're gonna have to like either use a co-working spot, a shared work spot, or we need to get an office space, but maybe way less space than normal. And we're gonna require people to come into the office, two times a quarter, maybe once a week. Then you're going to have to kind of adjust what you want. So I wouldn't just jump into it, make the decision without kind of laying the groundwork for how you want to be perceived, how you want to operate, where do you want to spend your money, and then kind of make that decision. Because you don't have any employees, you don't have anything yet.
Right.
Do that thing first. Obviously, when you have employees, the decisions start becoming a little bit more difficult because you want to know what they
Yeah, it's
want.
harder. Yeah, 100%.
Right.
100%.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah, I guess we're good. So thanks a lot, Kalim, for sharing your insights on remote work culture. We wish
appreciate.
you and Blood Me all the best in your journey. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Feel free to check out blendmeinc. .com. You can follow me on LinkedIn, really active there. I'm trying to do a little bit more on YouTube. So feel free to connect and check out our podcast too, remotely1.com. We got to get you on there. We got to get you on there, babe. We got to get you on there. So I appreciate it. Thanks for
Sure.
having me.